Right, thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's a very wet and windy night where I am. I hope it's a little bit better where you are. My name's Alison Parkin, and I'm the Development Manager for our Patrons Programme here at the Landmark Trust. We're very lucky tonight to have Caroline Stanford, Landmark's historian, and Linda Lockett, who is the project manager for Calverley Old Hall, with us. Between them, they have an incredible knowledge of the building and its history, which they're going to share with us this evening. So before I hand over to Caroline and Linda, there are a couple of very quick housekeeping points to note. We're using auto captioning for this talk. If you'd like to enlarge the captions, there's a little button at the bottom of your screen which says show captions. Using that button, you can either make them larger, or if you find them really annoying, you prefer not to see them at all, please feel free to just turn them off using the same button. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. If you've got a question, you don't need to wait until the end of the talk. You can submit it at any point by typing it into the Q&A box, which is, again, at the bottom of your screen, about a third of the way along. If you type it into there, we'll do our very best to answer as many questions as we can at the end of the talk. So I hope you're sitting comfortably, and I'd like to hand over to Caroline, who's going to tell us about the history of Calverley Old Hall.
Thank you very much, Alison, and hello everyone. It's wonderful, as Alison said, that so many of you have joined us tonight. So thank you for tuning in. I will just find my screen. And so off we go. A very short introduction to 900 years of history at Calverley Old Hall. Many of you, I think, will have heard one of these talks on Calverley before. But as we approach the opening next week, my contribution here is going to be a refresher and an update on the history of the place, now from the vantage point of the very end of the project. We found out a great deal more about the Calverley family, and our interpretation of the building itself has changed significantly. Plus, of course, we've discovered the wonderful Tudor painted chamber. First, a reminder that Landmark has owned this site since 1981, after it was part gutted by fire. Of course, there was an earlier landmark for 5 in the lodging block from 1988 until 2021. The rest kept mothballed. So it was unfinished business for us to try to find a way to bring the whole building back into use. There were several attempts to find a solution. That we've finally done so is honestly nothing less than a triumph, and one that everybody involved and contributing to should be very proud of. As ever, we just couldn't do any of this without your help and support. There have been many generations of Calverleys, and to be honest, I've given up trying to do a family tree, which in any case would run to more than one page. So I think this contents page from the history volume of the album serves as good a summary as any of the many Walters and Williams who succeeded each other over some 600 years, and they were all nearly Walters and Williams. Many of them left their mark on the building, and you may remember this graphic from earlier talks. The earliest part of the building in the centre here, we now call, has long been called, the solar block. But as the old hall was originally built, this is actually a misleading term. In fact, this block was originally built around 1320 as a hall house with a great hall on its first floor. We always knew there must have been an earlier great hall, but in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, we assumed that it was on the site of the surviving one over here. Instead, it was here, and we now know too that it had a solar range at right angles extending across here, the solar being private rooms for the family. It's now in the 16th century, or in the 16th century, it was absorbed into the lodging block, and some of the its earliest roof timbers still remain in the roof space here. After that phase came the Great Hall and the chapel. Then around 1520, the parlour block was added, filling the space between this early solar range here and the chapel. And a little sacristy was also added alongside the chapel, later converted in the 19th century to a cottage. And a generation later, this parlour block was upgraded and given a fine timber ceiling on the ground floor and the magnificently painted chamber above. And then finally, the lodging block is added at the end of the 16th century. This can all be summarised in this phased floor plan, and the orange section here shows the extent of the earliest 1320 hall house with its solar wing. Calverley Old Hall is listed Grade 1, and it must be stressed what an incredibly rare survival it is as such a complete sequence of a medieval manor house. And apologies that the compass point on it, it's most inconveniently oriented, Calverley Old Hall. If only we could swivel it by 90 degrees. Everything is northwest or southeast, etc. But hopefully you can make the transition between the floor plan here and the graphic. This reinterpretation of the building had been missed by all previous building analysts in the 1980s, and it came about in part because of an extensive programme of cutting-edge short ring sequence timber analysis by Historic England, and in part too, thanks to our brilliant project archaeologist, Jonathan Clark. Here, for example, is an unpromising bit of timber in the solar block. In fact, it's the survival of 1320s timber framing, when the early hall house was timber framed at first floor level. First floor halls are increasingly being identified. Two other landmarks, Astley and Woodsford Castles, for example, both had first floor halls as well. Markenfield Hall near Ripon is a more local and contemporary example to Calverley, and indeed Calverleys are known to have married Markenfields in the Middle Ages. Such spaces would once have been busy, bustling places. So it was only after the Great Hall was built in the 1480s that the solar block settled into its current name as an accurate name for it, and that's a use that today's sitting room echoes. There's Markenfield Hall there, and you can see the first floor hall still in existence there. And this is a scene from a 15th century solar that I couldn't resist including. We can imagine the upper floor of the solar block at Calverley looking something like this in the 15th century. The surviving Great Hall was the next phase of the building. Its roof timbers felled between 1477 and 1497, constructed by one William Calverley, or the other William Calverley. You're probably familiar with its huge hammer beam roof resting on carved corbels from these before project pictures, shown here with its floor still cluttered with salvaged stone, and out of shot the remnants of the chimney breasts from its conversion into dwellings in the late 17th century. The chapel was built just a little later, between 1480 and 1505, and it's another amazing survival, especially its private gallery for the family. It has its own miniature hammer beam roof and an original boarded ceiling. The gallery and screen were probably preserved by having become part of the cottage that was later inserted in here, the screen plastered over as a partition wall. The chapel was restored by Landmark in the 1980s, and not much needed to be done this time round. It remains a place for quiet contemplation, and in the new scheme too, and now has a small interpretation display below the gallery. We can imagine the Calverleys entering the gallery from their solar for quiet prayer or to watch the priest below celebrating Mass. This is, in fact, Lady Margaret Beaufort, Henry VII's mother, but the scene at Calverley must have been very similar. It was an age when religion was a means to display wealth and status as well as piety. The next generation brings us into the age of the Tudors, and we meet Sir Walter Calverley, the fourth, that is. He was knighted on campaign with Henry VIII in France in 1513 for his part in the English victory known as the Battle of the Spurs, and he fought more than once against the Scots in the retinue of Lord Darcy, the local grandee. It's not impossible that he also accompanied Lord Darcy to the famous meeting in northern France between Henry VIII and Francois I of France, known as the Field of the Cloth of Gold for its magnificence, and Lord Darcy was certainly present there. And this was the world that the Calverleys inhabited, the very French fields that Sir Walter gained his spurs upon. So this Sir Walter was responsible for adding the parlour block envelope, perhaps on the site of an earlier stair turret. Its wide but quite plain hearth on the ground floor suggests it may have been intended as a kitchen initially. As first built, the block did not have this fine moulded ceiling, which was added in the next phase by Sir Walter's son, William. Now, this William is the Calverley we now know most about. We now enter the 1530s, the decade of Henry VIII's break with the Pope in Rome and the establishment of the Church of England, with Henry as its head. This and the many other administrative reforms pushed through by Thomas Cromwell was too much for many to stomach, and the North and the East rebelled in 1537 in the so-called Pilgrimage of Grace, when a Master Calverley was again included in Lord Darcy's muster roll to be ready upon an hour's notice in the King's service. Lord Darcy, however, was beheaded for treason after the rebellion, and it seems our William Calverley, then in his 20s, was imprisoned for his faith in the Tower of London. Here, he repented that Catholic faith and wrote this extraordinary, learned, and lengthy poem in blank verse, published as a dialogue between the plaintiff and the defendant. William then capitulated entirely to the Protestant regime, becoming a stalwart of the king in Yorkshire. He again fought in the Royal Army, this time in Scotland, in the so-called Wars of the Rough Wooing, where he was knighted in 1545. In 1548, by now ruled by Henry VIII's son, the fiercely Protestant Edward VI, he was appointed Sheriff of Yorkshire, the King's representative for the county. It was Sir William the Sheriff who was responsible for the upgrade of the parlour block and the painted chamber. And it's just possible that he asked for a portrait of himself to be included. Can you just make out the image of a man in Tudor dress in the circle? It's quite likely that this is Sir William, and there's another roundel in the room that similarly shows a Tudor lady. Could this be one of his two wives? The painted chamber is agreed by all to have been the discovery of a lifetime. Here's the cottage bedroom as it was, and the only clue to greater age was the jowl post in the corner, where we also suspected that there must have been an earlier doorway. And it was looking for this doorway to the left of the conservatory here that first revealed the first traces of wall paintings. Gradually, and only after tortuous permissions had been achieved, we were able to uncover the near complete scheme of Tudor wall paintings. Noisy works went on around in the rest of the building, so tantalizingly for much of the project, the painted chamber had to be kept covered up and protected, except for the occasional site visit. The paintings are so-called grotesque or antique work, named after the discovery of ancient Roman frescoes in Emperor Nero's lost Golden Palace, only rediscovered as a cave or grotto, they thought, in the 1480s. The paintings were named grotteschi, meaning from the cave in Italian, which gave us our word grotesque. This antique style became very popular in the later Italian Renaissance, and the fashion found its way to England through books of prints. You can see the similarity here between the Calverley beasts on the left and this 1540s Dutch print, and indeed with the frontispiece from the dialogue in the stacked vases or balustrades. Such paintings show that the Calverleys were a very cultured and educated family and moved in similar circles. The room was gently cleaned and lightly conserved through the summer by Opus Conservation. We were very keen that the paintings should still show their age and to resist any temptation to restore them. Its use as a bedroom has to be very strictly controlled. However, the painted chamber era represented a high point for the Calverleys. The next two generations reverted to the Catholic faith, by then against the law under Elizabeth I, and meaning that they could not hold public office. Anne Danby, seen here, the wife of the next Walter Calverley, was particularly resolute in her faith, described as of the worst sort by Elizabeth's men. Her son William was weak in his mind, given to outbursts in support of his religion at a time when to be Catholic was the equivalent of being a terrorist today. The Calverleys were repeatedly fined, and their estate suffered accordingly. Worse was to come when tragedy struck in 1605. The next Walter Calverley, son of lunatic William, married very young, and perhaps ill-advisedly. He soon came to believe that his wife was unfaithful to him, and some accounts say he was heavily indebted. In April 1605, he lost all control. He stabbed two of their three young sons to death and attempted the same on his wife. We don't know where in the building all this happened today. He was arrested as he rode off to find the third son and executed 4 months later in York by being pressed to death under heavy weights. His wife remarried, and the Calverley estate began a long, slow decline. The surviving baby son, Henry, inherited the estate when he came of age. He had an unlucky life, the estate exploited by his stepfather, and then he was heavily fined by Cromwell's men for supposedly supporting Charles I in the Civil War, although I think more likely he was simply caught up in a web of local loyalties. When he died in 1651, the estate was in a bad way. Luckily, however, the next Walter Calverley married a rich heiress, Frances Thompson of nearby Esholt Hall. This meant Walter moved out of old-fashioned Calverley Old Hall into Esholt Hall. A generation later, in 1706, his son, also Walter, and also married to an heiress, Julia Blackett of Wallington Hall in Northumberland, knocked down old Esholt Hall and built the one that survives today. It's now the headquarters of Yorkshire Water, and you can still see the Calverley crest, the horned owl, on the rainwater hoppers there. Walter and Julia's son, another Walter, settled definitively in Northumberland, and in 1754 he sold Calverley Old Hall to Thomas Thornhill of Fixby, a local grandee satirised here on the left in this cartoon. Already subdivided into several dwellings, the old hall was now divided into as many as 9 cottages, seen here in chocolate box colours in watercolours by a local artist, Fred Swain. And it's from these cottage years in the 18th and 19th century that hundreds of deliberately concealed finds date, discovered in wall cavities and under eaves during the repair works. We quite often find the odd shoe or piece of clothing concealed in this way during restoration works, but the sheer number at Calverley is quite unprecedented. It's thought these humble everyday objects, many of them broken and worn, were concealed as good luck charms against evil spirits. It's hard not to associate them with the long folk memory of the murders. A selection are now on display in the chapel. All have been returned to the building, carefully stored in archive boxes. So we come to the 20th century, cottage life continuing, but the buildings increasingly run down. Even the chapel was colonised with another pair of cottages added on beside it. Then in 1977, disaster struck in Mr. Pratt the milkman's store in the lodging block, and the wing was gutted by fire. The Thornhill estate decided to put the whole site up for sale in 3 lots, and it was here that Landmark stepped in to keep this important medieval building in one ownership. And so this is how the lodging block has been, familiar probably to many of you, until the last guests moved out in 2021. But now it's been superseded by something much more exciting. And for that, I'm going to hand over to Linda to tell you all about the latest project works.
Bear with me while I set up my presentation and share it with you. Thank you, Caroline. That was a very interesting introduction and history of the building. I'll now take you through a few of the highlights of the restoration. It's only when I started putting the slideshow together that I realised we'd done so much over the last 3 years. I'll take you through the restoration, the wall painting conservation, and I have a few slides of what it looks like now it's been furnished. So the project can be divided into 3 phases. The first one, we re-roofed, and that was funded by the Culture Recovery Fund money post-COVID. And we were able to take a big chunk of the work out of the main contract, let it early, and make a start on the building work before the main restoration took place. We then did a second phase where we upgraded and converted the landmark, and the third phase was the conservation and presentation of the wall paintings. The total cost of the project was £5.1 million. And I think we got quite a bargain actually for the amount of work we've done to Calverley Old Hall. But you'll see for yourself as I take you through the works we've just completed. So phase 1, roof repairs, that started in late 2021, where we erected a temporary roof over the solar, where we'd the first floor hall, the wall paintings room, the roof of that, the parlour block, which was probably in the worst condition of any of the roofs on site, and was the one that actually got us the Culture Recovery Fund money because of the urgency of keeping the water out. Once we had the temporary roof up, we were able to strip the slates and have a good look at the timber roof structure. In this picture, you can see Dominic Dobson, the site foreman. We've got Jonathan Clark, the archaeologist, and Michael, our foreman joiner, all looking and examining the timbers and working out what repairs are required. We were lucky. The timber roof was in a much better condition than we thought it was. This valley gutter you can see here was probably the worst of the areas, but we were able to strip that out and renew it. the rest of the roof we examined carefully, and we had a philosophy of just repairing what we needed to and not replacing timbers wholesale. There's a picture here of myself with Robert Radcliffe, the engineer, who helped us decide on the repair methods for all of the timbers. Here's a selection of some of the repairs we undertook. A scarf joint. So this is a purlin, and we spliced in a new section of timber here to replace a section which was rotten. Here's another on the right-hand side where you can see we've infilled a slot in the timber where there'd been some damage. We've then flitched it, which is putting in a piece of steel work to reinforce it. And this is then bolted into the timber with steel bolts there. And a third example is this section of timber, which is just behind the scaffold pole. Not quite so easy to see, but here we use some of the many bits of old timber that had been left on site from the cottages which had been demolished a few years earlier. So one of our philosophies on site was to try and reuse as much of the material on site as possible, and part of that sustainability was to reuse the old timbers. Here's one of the most complicated bits of repair work we had to do. This is one of the 14th century posts that formed the Great Hall or solar. And it had rotted away at its junction with the beam that runs across the centre of the room. The bracket was luckily intact with its lovely carving, but we had to dismantle a huge section of stonework here to get to the back of the post so that we could repair it and replace it. We worked out how to do this, a collaboration between the engineer and the joiner and the architect, and we came up with this repair, which just really took away the worst of the timber and enabled us to peg in new bits using traditional construction techniques. We then had to rebuild the wall. What's really interesting about this section is you can see the side of the chimney, the great fireplace in the solar. And this was a large cavity, which is where most of the finds that Caroline showed you earlier, the shoes, the children's clothes, etc., were found. Moving on to the completion of the roof, again, sustainability for when we convert to the landmark. We wanted to make sure that the building was well insulated. So during this phase of work, we insulated the underside of the roof using a parvotherm insulation, which is a wood wool slab, which is fixed to the underside of the rafters, and then from above filled with a softwood wool, which enabled us to get a much better insulation than had been there in the past. Once this was done, we then moved on to plastering on the inside. So this is a lime plaster. The whole construction is completely breathable and sustainable. So that's the philosophy we took throughout the building when it came to insulation. And on completion of that, we relaid the slates. We managed to save about 80% of the original slates from the roof, and these were supplemented with new stone slates. We think these very Yorkshire stone slates came from a quarry in Pudsey, which originally had been owned by the Calverley family. You can see here that there's some fairly large slabs. The lowest ones were up to about 6 foot in length and took 2 or 3 men to manoeuvre into position. While the roofing was going on, we were carrying out some structural repairs internally. Here you can see two of the bricklayers who were working on this job. Ellie Dobson, who was who's a bricklayer, and her enthusiasm and constant questioning led us to put her forward for the SPAB William Morris Craft Fellowship, and she's currently touring the country learning about building conservation. On the right there, you can see Colin, a senior bricklayer who taught a lot to Ellie and to us. This was his final job. He's now retired. Having completed that first phase of structural repairs to the roof and re-roofing, we then moved on to the restoration of the building and its fitting out as a landmark. We'd spent many years trying to decide what to do at Calverley Old Hall, and after a few failed attempts to take it forward and restore it, we decided we needed to come up with another solution for it. And because we were struggling, we decided to hold a design competition. We had 70 entries and 11 people put forward a design for it. And from those, we selected Cowper Griffiths Architects, who really satisfied the brief, retaining the most important elements of the hall and its historical features, and the intervention that they created within it really highlighted the history of the building, and we thought showed off the importance of the structure. We're creating a landmark which has 5 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms, and converting the Great Hall into an entrance hall and kitchen diner, and putting a sitting room in the first floor solar. We also created a community space in what was the original landmark, and one bedroom short-term lease apartment above it. I'll take you on a quick tour of the building now and some of the work we did internally. I'll start off in the cross passage, which is the west end of the Great Hall. This is the area that would have originally formed the main entrance to the Great Hall, with a entrance on either side, a doorway on either side, and it would have passed through this lower room, which until 2006 was the sitting room of one of the little houses on that form Calverley Old Hall. And upstairs, the part of the Great Hall was used as a bedroom. And you can see here the spear truss running through and poking out the underside of the ceiling. Now keep an eye on that, because things change as we move through the work that was undertaken. So this is the beam we were looking at. We opened up this area so that you could see over the top of the wall and down into the solar, took out all the late 19th century partitions and floor. And this is the architect, and the plasterer and the joiner looking at the repairs that we've got to do to the structure and the work that's required to the ceiling. This is us putting the new floor in, which would form a gallery and a stairwell within that space. This is us constructing the staircase, a complicated and brave intervention by the architects. It's a cantilevered staircase made of laminated timber supported off an open screen. So the staircase have nothing to support themselves, treads have nothing to support themselves, but each other and this open screen. We had to do mock-ups, and we built the staircase dry before it was erected finally on site. A lot of work, but we think worth it for the final effect. This is the cross passage with the doorway at the rear of the building, looking as you'd come into the building. This is the screen, reconstructing our screen's passage, and a glimpse of the stairway beyond, and the staircase which takes you up to the gallery above. During the works, we found this fireplace, which had been hidden behind layers and layers of anaglypta and floral wallpaper. And here's the stair gallery finished, and you can see that spear truss again and a view over into the hall beyond. And we'll move into the Great Hall now. Caroline showed you pictures of the fireplace, and there's a little glimpse here of a bit of the part of the cottages, because the Great Hall had been divided into two cottages. And most of the walls had been removed in the 1980s. This is the architect's vision of what the hall should look like, with the remains of that cottage wall, behind which is the stair hall and gallery. A complex piece of work to do. We had to take up the floor. There were very little in the way of foundations here. So it was a careful excavation of the floor so we could get insulation and underfloor heating in. This is a meeting between the services engineers and the contractors and architect, agreeing how this could best be done. After a phase of excavation and repair and installation of underfloor heating pipes, we were able to relay the original stone floor. Jigsaw puzzle laid by Ellie. It took quite a lot to take these up and number them all and get them all back in exactly the position they came up. So when you go to the hall, you'll see where the ash pits to the fireplace was and where all the walls and post holes had been from the cottages that had been built within the hall. So once the floor was laid, we then went about creating panelling around the inside of the wall, which was insulated again with Parvatherm, the similar type of insulation to that used in the solar roof. This is then panelled with oak panelling, and the purpose of this panelled area is to take all the services which would supply the kitchen and lighting and give us a nice sense of scale to the building, bring down the scale. It's a large space and a high or church-like space. Following completion of the panelling, we installed the kitchen. Now that was designed by our own team and installed by them. This is a picture of us agreeing the designs at their Honeybourne workshop. We're actually leaning on the island unit, looking at how we can put a new worktop on the oak cabinets. We eventually agreed a concrete worktop, which sounds quite radical and a bit 21st century for Landmark, but we feel it works and creates a very exciting and unusual kitchen. So this is the completed Great Hall with its new kitchen range and island unit and great dining table. And here, looking back, you can see this spear truss across the top of the wall and into the gallery beyond. Moving on to the solar. This was an open space which had lost most of its interior structures. It had been divided into cottage bedrooms and sitting rooms, and the original floor had been removed many centuries before. It had been stripped out by archaeologists in the 1980s, so we had a completely bare space. We had the original 1320s fireplace floating in midair, and wanted to recreate that feeling of the first floor hall or solar. The walls are very delicate around the sides of this solar block, thin and much repaired and changed over the years. So the floor we agreed on with the engineer was one which was supported of steel posts, which came out of the ground, so that these delicate walls could be tied back to it and given some strength. The work started again with archaeologists looking to see what they could find. And it looks again, as with the hall, that the solar was built on virgin ground. They created the formwork that was used to create the concrete pads that would take the steel work. And after that was poured, we erected a steel frame, the framework within the partitions of the ground floor rooms, and started to build the timber studwork and install the floor that would subdivide the ground floor into bedrooms and create a sitting room on the first floor. So this is the miraculous transformation of the solar from an open space to one with a grand sitting room and a fabulous fireplace, making the most of this wonderful window on the south side of the solar. And this is it furnished with the fireplace with sofas either side and a view through to the great solar window. On the ground floor, we created 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, one of the bathrooms having accessible features. I'll move on to sustainability. This is one thing that we wanted to include in this building, was to be as sustainable as possible. I've shown you some of the measures that were taken to insulate the roof. We put in a sustainable heating system, a ground source heat pump, and on the right hand side you'll see the drilling rig drilling one of the 132 deep boreholes. There were 6 in total, and they draw heat from the ground and take it to our new plant room, which houses a heat store, this large vessel at the back here, and the heat pump, which converts the water that's taken from the ground to heat this unit here. So we've got a large supply of hot water, which will supply both the central heating system as well as the hot water. This is supplemented by PV panels on the roof. We're lucky to have a hidden elevation of the roof, which we've been able to hide an array of PV panels. Moving on to the insulation, it's no good putting in a state-of-the-art sustainable heating system if we don't insulate the building. I've already shown you what we've done on the solar roof and in the Great Hall on the lower walls. We also insulated the underside of the Great Hall ceiling using wood wool, sheep's wool insulation. And this is one of our plasterers putting a lime plaster skim over the top of the insulation. Servicing the building was quite complex as well. This is one of the most complex servicing jobs the Landmark have ever done. We've put underfloor heating for the whole of the ground floor and the solar on the first floor. And that's all controlled by a building management system. So we have thermometers in the underfloor heating area, the underfloor area outside and in every single room. And the temperature of those spaces is controlled by a building management computer. And on the right hand side, you can see this computer in one of the housekeepers' stores. The computer was really put in to manage the painted chamber. It was one area where we need to try and keep a steady environment for the wall paintings. And if we were going to occupy it for domestic use, we needed to be able to regulate both temperature and humidity. So if you stay in that room, you'll find that the humidity and temperature is constant. The temperature will be slightly lower than the rest of the building, between 16 and 17 degrees, but we provided a nice thick duvet to compensate for that. Now onto the conservation of the wall paintings. This is the very, very bland 19th century looking room where we found the wall paintings. Caroline's already told you about the discovery of them. I'll tell you a bit about how we conserved them. But first, I'd just like to say a bit about the floor. The floor is contemporary with the wall paintings. It's a very worn oak floor with a big dip in the middle. And we only found this when we took the Edwardian floorboards off. This is as important and an integral part of the wall painting scheme. So this has been carefully repaired. You can see here some little patches have been put in where the timber was rotten and reinforced with a steel beam down the centre. It has then been polished using a traditional beeswax polish, beeswax and turpentine, and this finish has been taken throughout the hall. And this is the conservation of the wall paintings. The first process was to try and remove some of the dust that had built up over the years. So our conservators, with the aid of a vacuum cleaner and a toothbrush, went round the entire room, just hoovering up any dust from the surface. And it's amazing just how much of a difference that one process made. You can see from the pictures down here, we've got the same roundel with a beast painted within it, and how little you can see on the left-hand picture compared to the right. Once the whole room had been vacuumed, it took about a week and a half. The conservators then went over the whole wall painting with effectively a cotton pud dipped in acetone to remove the next layer of dirt and reveal even more of the painting. The third and final stage of the cleaning was using tissue. So what they call a lens tissue was put against the wall. It was wet with water, and then a consolidant called Clucel was applied over the surface of it. This Clucel soaked through the tissue paper onto the paint below, which was very friable. And when the tissue paper was removed, it left some of the consolidant to hold together this very delicate paintwork and removed another layer of dirt with it. The wall paintings, having been cleaned and consolidated, were then looked at on a visual point, from a visual point of view, and toning undertaken to improve the legibility of the design. There was no intention ever to restore the wall paintings. The only work that has been done has been to make them more legible. So using small toothbrushes and acrylic paint was chosen because it could be removed from the water-based paints and was entirely reversible. You can see here one of the conservators, Amarilli, touching in the paintwork behind the grotesques. Now you can see here a before and after the touching in, and you'll see that we've got a patch of exposed pink plaster. Now this, we thought, took your eye away from the design. So they've quite simply just recreated the decoration on these pink bits of plaster, not really touching any of the original design or original paintwork, so that the whole design pops out at you. You can see here how there's just been a little bit of touching up of black so that the design pops out at you and your eye isn't taken away by all the areas of pink. This is Sam and Lizzie. They are from Opus Conservation, and they're the owners of the company who did the conservation work for us. Lizzie, when I spoke to her at the end, said it had been a real honour to work on this project because it was really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. They've done an absolutely fantastic job of bringing the wall paintings back to life again. And this is the room complete. It's now a bedroom where you'd be able to stay and sleep under a warm duvet. And we've managed to get access after having jumped through many hoops with the planning authority. We've been allowed to use it as a bedroom. On the left-hand side, you can see the steps leading up into the painted chamber from the solar and the backs of these painted walls. And outside, we've done a lot of landscaping work, which has changed the appearance of the hall from the outside. And this is a view up the path to the front door. And I'd like to finish with a photograph of the team, of some of the team of people who have contributed to the project and have made it all possible. From left to right, we've got Hannah, who was involved with the engagement and organised all the community engagement projects. Kate, who did all the administration. Then Karen, the architect from Cowper Griffiths. Myself, Andy, the site foreman. James, who managed the project from the office. Darren, who's the contract administrator, and Marcus and Mark, the double act who installed all the services. That was a very quick run through, and if you've got any questions, please ask them now. Please type them into the questions box at the bottom. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, Caroline and Linda. That was absolutely fascinating. I must admit, I'm really looking forward next week to going up to Leeds. We've got some engagement events next weekend, and I absolutely can't wait to see the building. I've only seen it unfurnished, and following on from that, I'm really, really looking forward to it. If anybody's got any questions, just drop them into the chat. I've had one question offline, which potentially could be for either of you. You mentioned the community space. What sort of things are you going to use that for, and what's been the sort of community engagement with the project?
Shall I deal with that, Linda? So this, we did a feasibility study, or sorry, an options appraisal study right at the very, very beginning of project development. And the idea of a flexible community use space was one of the ideas that came out of that. It is a pretty rugged space. It sits within the footprint of the old landmark sitting room, has AV facilities, but we hope it'll be used not just for meetings and such like for small groups, but also has potential for workshops. And Hannah and Vicky, our engagement team, ran many fabulous outreach workshops of stone carving, joinery, screen printing, all sorts of things in that space. So it's very versatile and very flexible, and can be booked through the landmark website now. It has a little kitchenette as well, and obviously a loo.
Thank you. Another offline question actually is to do with the painted chamber. This might be one for Linda. You've spoken a little bit about the measures to protect the paintings. What's the sort of monitoring on that, and what kind of measures would you take to make sure that the paintings are protected and that they're going to be around for generations to come?
Yes, well, we've got a very a controlled environment, which is really the biggest danger for the wall paintings, because they're on a mixture of timber and plaster, and if you get differential movement, that's when the paint is likely to flake off. We're going to have them inspected regularly, and if there's any damage, we'll kind of address how we deal with that. The consolidation of them should keep them in a better condition and stop them from breaking down. We've cut the UV light out of the building. It's got shutters on the outside which stops the sunlight coming in directly, and really the only concerns are damage done by gas. But we've got loads of other wall paintings in our buildings, and over the 60 years life of Landmark, we've had very little damage to them. Wonderful guests who take care of our properties.
Excellent. Somebody's asked, would the building originally have had a gallery?
I think we don't know for sure. It's likely that it might, well, that the Great Hall built in the 1480s could have had a gallery. The very early 1320s first floor hall, we think, had an external staircase more or less on the site of the cross passage. So there could have been a gallery. We don't honestly know, but it's certainly the mezzanine floor that's been put in gives an absolutely fabulous view of the roof timbers of the Great Hall, as you saw. So whether there was or not, we think it's worth having one.
Another question here. You mentioned 2 bedrooms in the solar block. Where are the other 3?
There's one in the painted chamber. There's one in the room below that. The painted chamber's on the first floor, and there's one which is in a part of the building which used to be part of the Landmark. So if you ever stayed in the big double bedroom in the Landmark, that's now another bedroom and bathroom, which is part of the new Landmark.
this is an interesting one. I don't know whether you know the answer to this one. Are there any living Calverley descendants? Do we know the answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, the Calverleys were a huge family. You know, they often had children. Our Sir William the Sheriff is said to have had 17 children with his two wives. So yes, I'm sure there are many Calverleys scattered all over. We've had one or two get in touch, not many, but yeah, there are other Calverleys.
Yeah, we've had a few turn up on site actually.
Oh wow!
Just speculatively saying we're Calverleys and we're interested in seeing the building. So yes, we've had to turn a lot of people away and tell them to wait for the open days.
Could you tell us a little bit about the surrounding environs of the building over the course of its life, and why was that original site? Do we know anything about why that original site would have been chosen to build it?
We don't really. I mean, I think it would have been that the land was allocated way back after the Norman conquest to the Scott family originally, who became the Scotts of Calverleys and then the Calverleys. So we don't really know why that spot was chosen, other than that it's within rich rolling farmland originally. It's just above the River Aire, so it's on nice high ground, and yeah, we can imagine it as a sort of fertile rolling countryside in the Middle Ages. So I can't really say more than that.
Somebody's asked, given the that the family were Catholic in tricky times, is there a priest hole, or do we know whether there would have been a priest hole?
No, I mean, the Calverleys seem to have been quite out and proud about being Catholic, to be honest. And the chapel was there. They were known. I think they probably kept on the right side of the law in the sense that they didn't become involved in any conspiracies. Obviously, there were lots of Catholic conspiracies during Elizabeth's reign, the Anthony Babington plot and so on. But the Calverleys just were devout, I think. So there is no evidence of a priest hole. They were known to be recusants, to be Catholics, and yeah. So I guess they didn't need a priest hole.
Is there a lot of local interest in the building?
Oh yes, we've had a huge amount of interest. And a lot of engagement with the local community, as Caroline's already hinted at, and a lot of enthusiasm for the project, with it having not been neglected as such, but just being slightly tatty around the edges. They're really pleased to see that something's been done with the building now, and to have something so magnificent on their street. So we get a lot of questions from locals when I go there, and they're all interested to see how it's coming on.
Oh, that's good to know. Actually, on that point, I think there are still spaces on some of there's a public open day, isn't there, next weekend on the 6th of October. I think there are still some spaces on that. Details will be on the Calverley webpage if anybody's interested. If you go to the Calverley webpage, you'll have the details of that, and you can sign up for a place. But I think that's on Sunday, the 6th of October.
Calverley is going to have quite a lot of open days over the next few years. We're planning to have them at fairly regular intervals. So if you can't make next Sunday, keep an eye out on the website and see what comes up over the next few months.
Oh, this is one for Linda. Somebody's saying you've done an absolutely stunning job, Linda. Do you have a next big project on your desk?
I've got a pile of next big projects on my desk. I mean, some of you may have been to Wentworth Woodhouse, and there's a tiny little house up in Scotland just south of Edinburgh, which is coming on the horizon, Mavis Bank. So yes, there's quite a lot, and a few irons in the fire as well.
You're not going to take off and have a long rest then?
Oh, I could do with the rest. I'll have a little rest.
Have there been any archaeological excavations in the grounds outside the house?
Yes, there have, without anything of great significance being found. You can imagine in drilling 6 143-metre boreholes, the ground source heating for the building, that we had to make very, very sure that we weren't destroying any archaeology. So we were slightly disappointed that they didn't find more, in fact, in a way. But on the other hand, it made life easier on the project.
Lovely. Somebody's asked, when we stayed there, we found a trap door under the rug in the living room with steps going to a room underground. Is that still there, and what was it used for?
It's just a cellar. It's just a cellar. It's not accessible anymore now, because of the changes that we've made to that area.
Yeah, we've filled the basements full of services now. So there's air source heat pump or ground source heat pump equipment in every space that we've got.
Excellent. I think that's probably pretty much all we've got time for tonight. So I'd like to just say thank you very much, Caroline and Linda, for taking time out of what is an incredibly busy schedule for both of you, especially running up to the building opening. I know you've both been incredibly busy, so thank you very much for taking the time out. If you've got questions that we haven't had time to answer, do just drop us an email and we'll do our best to get back to you. As Linda's mentioned, there will be open days, so keep an eye on the website. Come and see the building. It's absolutely stunning. And then finally, just thank you everybody for joining us tonight. It's thanks to support from people like you that we're actually able to do these restorations and renovate buildings like this. So thank you very much for all your support, and I hope we'll see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.